Okay, I'm going to turn on my camera and share the screen. So just a minute,
Sure.
everyone.
And I just want to introduce you because we are really lucky to have you to have you for the welcoming day. And I know that October is the month of occupational therapy, and it's also I think on Thursday there's the World Sight Day. So
Screen
I know
share.
you
Meeting
probably
controls.
have.
Participants can now.
There's okay.
Blank. Mute. Currently unmuted. Alt V. Video now started.
Perfect. Hi, everyone. Yes.
So I just want to introduce Natalina Martiniello, which is a previous member of the student committee of Créer, and she's also a postdoctoral research fellow of the Department of Psychology at Concordia University. She's also a member of the Institut Nazareth et Louis Braille of the CIS de la Montérégie Centre. She's also the director of International Council on English Braille. She was the past president of Braille Literacy Canada, and she's the vice chair of International Network of Researchers with Visual Impairment and Their Allies, Innova. So thank you, Natalina, for being here today, and I'll give you you can go ahead, and thank you so much.
PowerPoint
Perfect.
slideshow
Thank you. So you will all hear my screen reading software in the background. All right. Well, thank you for inviting me today. I'm very happy to be here. As mentioned, my name is Natalina Martiniello, although I know quite a few of you in the participant list, so it's nice to see some familiar names. I'm very happy to be talking to you today about accessibility and inclusion of your research communication tools. Specifically for colleagues and participants with visual impairments, so blindness and low vision. But what I'll be sharing today, what's really important to highlight is that these are guidelines that will really improve accessibility and inclusion for everyone. So on this title slide, I include my email address and my Twitter handle. Like other topics in equity, diversity, and inclusion, the learning doesn't really stop here. And so I do encourage you to reach out to me if you have questions or if you're looking for more resources. I will be presenting in English, but my slides are in French, and I'm very happy at the end to answer questions in English or in French.
Page down. Slide
All
2
right.
dash.
So what will we be talking about today? So I'd like to begin by addressing some of the myths and misconceptions around blindness and low vision in particular, and what impact they may have on the accessibility and inclusion of the research communication process. We'll then connect this more broadly to concepts related to people with disabilities more generally, and accessibility and inclusion. And what you'll see by the end, I hope, is that when you proactively ensure that your research communication tools are accessible and inclusive from the start, this really will benefit everyone. So not just people with visual impairments or people with disabilities more generally, but also others who work alongside you, regardless of whether you know whether they have a lived experience with disability. We'll talk about why accessibility and inclusion in research matters. Obviously, all of you here are involved in rehabilitation, so many of you are already committed to this, but it's important to kind of talk about that so you can explain it to others as well. And where does it come up? Where in your research, kind of the research process, does accessibility and inclusion come up for you to think about? And we'll be going through some really practical strategies for how you can increase the accessibility and inclusion of your research communication tools. So one overarching goal that I have is to try to minimize some of the intimidation kind of around accessibility and inclusion. There's often a misconception that you need to be very tech savvy to make your documents accessible, but you'll see that there's a lot of really simple things you can do to really increase accessibility for everyone.
Page down. Slide 3 dash localization.
Right.
Localization.
So an individual's social location is defined as a combination of factors, including gender, race, social class, age, ability, religion, sexual orientation, and geographic location. What this means is that social location, so the different parts of who we are, is particular to each and every one of us. It isn't the same for any two people. So when we're talking about advancing research equity, it's really important for us to collectively be thinking about and acknowledging our own social location. We each bring often very unconscious experiences of power, privilege, and oppression, which shape not only how we think about disability inclusion in research, but also where we position ourselves in relation to this topic. So, for example, if I share just briefly about my own lived experience, I am a person who is blind, and I'm also a white middle to upper class female, and I've benefited very much from a strong education. I hold a PhD, and I'm very involved in research and advocacy related to accessibility and inclusion. So what this means is that I recognize that I have a unique platform and privilege that not everyone with a disability has. And while I don't represent a community at all, I do recognize that I have this platform to share some of the common experiences that we have. At the same time, I also experience different forms of oppression in research, both as a female and as a person with a disability. And this is often linked to different misconceptions, not only about disability, but also revolving around women in science. And this can lead to a lot of barriers related to accessibility. So for example, I've been to conferences, even in our own field, where a colleague who happens to be with me is mistaken as a volunteer who's there to help me. I've been to conferences, again, in our field, where I'm mistaken as a participant. And so these really deep-rooted, but really often unconscious ideas about disability prevent us from always seeing people with disabilities as experts or as colleagues who work alongside us. And instead, we often tend to equate disability as referring to patients or recipients of care. And when we don't expect to see people with disabilities in these research spaces, this often means that we won't proactively think about accessibility when we're creating our research communication tools. So I encourage you, I invite you to think about your own positionality whenever you're doing research and thinking about accessibility and inclusion. What assumptions might you bring, and how might this shape the way you think or don't think about accessibility when you're doing research? You may not have lived experience with disability, but may have other experiences related to difference and exclusion that can function as really important points of connection.
Jism Coker has joined the meeting.
This is really where allyship is born, through those points of connection.
Page down. Martiniello - accessibility and slide.
All right. So let's talk really briefly about some of these myths and misconceptions, specifically around visual impairment and how they might affect accessibility and inclusion. So I'd like you to tell me if you think the following statements are true or false. So we'll deal with each one at a time. The first one, legal blindness refers to someone who has no usable vision. Do we think this is true or false? Anyone could answer in the chat, or you can speak up. What do we think?
From Bridget Fillion to everyone : faux.
Faux, parfait. Perfect. You're all hearing.
I would also say false
Yeah.
as well.
Excellent,
For
excellent.
Jessica Hansen, student committee to everyone : false.
False. You're getting to hear what it's like when I use a screen reader, because it reads
From
out all
Emmanuel
the
Girasizer to everyone :
comments. There you go. Perfect. That is correct, right? So really legal blindness, most people with legal blindness do have some usable vision. Some people may have perfect central vision, so they don't need any assistive technology to access information, so print, but they may have poor side vision, which
Caroline
means
Elfrisi
that they may not see obstacles as they're moving in the environment, so they'll use a guide dog or a white cane. On the other hand, someone may have very poor central vision, and so they need to use large print or braille or screen reading software. But they don't have any problems with their side vision. So maybe they don't always need to use a mobility device. And the takeaway here is that you will not always know when someone has a visual impairment. So you really can't base your decisions on whether to make something accessible based on what you see. So the next statement, most people who are blind are born with a visual impairment. Is that true or false? What do we think?
Hi, Natalie. Josh here.
Hi.
I would say that's probably false.
Absolutely, exactly. So that is false. It was very much true in the past, but more and more, like other types of disabilities, we're seeing an increased prevalence of visual impairment later on in life due to aging. So what this means is that often accessibility and inclusion will not only benefit kind of the traditional examples you might think of, but also your colleagues who are older, 50 years and up, who may not have a diagnosis, but may still benefit from considerations when you're developing your print information. Finally, most people who are blind are auditory learners. What do we think about that? Is this true or false?
From Melissa Gannett to everyone : false.
False, exactly. You guys are seeing the trend. These are all false.
From Emmanuel Birasizer to everyone : false.
Exactly. So this is false, but it's a really huge misconception, right? There's this idea that if you're blind, you're not only an auditory learner, but you also have heightened auditory senses. This is a misconception. Learning styles are really diverse, right? And so just like someone who's sighted, there are times when I may want to physically read something myself in Braille, right? And this is because something like Braille, just like print, this is a very active form of reading. And it can be really helpful if you're reading complex information, like what you might find in a consent form, right? So the big takeaway here is that there is no one-size-fits-all approach. People with visual impairments will use different forms of access to information depending on the task. And so you can't base the format that you produce based on, what you've experienced with a previous blind person. You really need to understand the diversity that exists within the community. Perfect.
Page down. Slide 5 dash.
All right. So let's talk a bit more about some of the concepts around accessibility and inclusion. So to understand usability versus accessibility, I like to use the analogy of the physical environment. So what I have here on the slide is a picture of a public space. So obviously, if a public facility only is equipped with stairs, it will be completely inaccessible to someone who uses a wheelchair, right? Similarly, a facility might be equipped with a ramp or elevators, so that person can access the environment, but certain aspects of the environment are not accessible. For example, it could be that some items are placed high up on the shelves and out of reach. So accessibility literally refers to a person being able to physically access the environment. And I think that's something that we all understand from our various disciplines, right? Access to the virtual environment, so websites and documents that you use in research, could be understood in the same way. So if a website or a document only contains visual images, right, that will be completely inaccessible to someone who uses assistive technology and to people with visual impairments. So CAPTCHA is a really good example of this. CAPTCHA, I show a picture here on the slide, is when you register for certain websites, you have to unscramble the words or write what you see in the picture. That's an image. So it's completely inaccessible, which prevents someone with a visual impairment from accessing that environment. If we think about research, if you are advertising your study with a poster, with a picture, that will be completely inaccessible as well. So you'll never reach the population you're hoping to reach. Okay, so if we take that example and we kind of talk about usability, an environment may be accessible, meaning you can access it, but it's not necessarily user-friendly. So what does this mean? So for example, if you enter a store, you might be able to physically enter the store, but it's really hard to find what you're looking for. Hospitals are great examples of this, right? It's really hard to find what you're looking for in a hospital.
Dominic Gaelinas Bronsett has joined the meeting.
So if we think about research communication tools, it's very similar. Often when we have long documents, like a consent form, it can be really hard to find specific information unless you really ensure that there's those landmarks in the document, like titles to divide different sections so that a person can more easily find what they're looking for. So when you're thinking about accessibility, don't just think about accessibility itself, but also how user-friendly that information is. Okay, we'll talk about what you can do to increase usability as well.
Page down. Slide 6-L accessibility.
So now, accessibility is really important, right? So obviously, if information isn't accessible, your colleagues and participants will be completely unable to access it. But what's really interesting here is that there's a really important point about who the gatekeepers of knowledge and research are. So ironically, only 5% of information is available in an accessible format. And what this means is that most information published, most research published about disability is not actually accessible to the people it's about. And this became really clear to me when I conducted a scoping review early on in my PhD study. And most of the articles I needed to access were completely inaccessible to me. And so the irony is that I'm a researcher conducting research on my community, but most of that information is not actually accessible to me. But while accessibility is important, it's only one aspect to remember, right? So increasingly, we're talking about other aspects of equity, diversity, and inclusion. And I like to use the analogy of a dance to help explain this. So accessibility literally means that you are able to read the information, the invitation, in large print or braille, for example, and enter the dance. Equity refers to fairness of choice, and it's not the same as equality. So you know this from your own rehabilitation disciplines. We may all be able to accomplish the same task, but not necessarily in the same way. So here I show a picture of different people watching a sports game, but they all need different number of boxes to be able to see, right, based on their heights. And so this refers to the importance of providing choice in the format of information. And so this becomes really important if we think about privacy in research, right? You may be able to read an invitation by having someone read it to you, but that isn't really private, right? It doesn't allow you to confidentially participate in a research study. So we need to be thinking about fairness of choice. Diversity refers to representation. So not just thinking about how you're accessing the information, but who is invited to the dance or who is a part of that research team. How are you talking about disability in those documents? Sometimes you might see language like people suffering from blindness, and that's really problematic language. And even if your information is accessible, you may turn people away if you're using that kind of language. So you want to be thinking about diversity and representation. Finally, inclusion refers to meaningfully being included once you're there. So not just being invited to the dance, but actually invited to dance. And in the context of research, this involves including people with disabilities from the start so that you can ensure that you're really addressing problems that exist.
Page down. Slide
right.
7-pourquoi.
So why
Does
does accessibility matter? I won't touch on this too much because I think we all know this as people involved in rehabilitation. But obviously, some reasons include you may not always know whether someone has a disability. There is a legal mandate, right? It's illegal to create barriers for people with disabilities, but hopefully we're not just doing it for that legal imperative, right? And then finally, it's more cost effective and takes less time. If you proactively make your content accessible, you don't have to fix it afterwards.
Page down. Tozin Omanayojadeng has joined the meeting. Slide 8. You brave.
Where does it come up in research? So let's think about the research cycle. So if we talk about research design, I mentioned, do you have any biases
has joined the
affecting the research questions that you're asking? And we touched on that a little bit. And you want to be thinking about that because it will influence how people from the community respond to your research. How about the research protocol itself, right? So if we're thinking about, for example, invitations to participate or consent forms, is that information accessible and inclusive? So if we think about consent forms, this includes kind of two aspects. Whether a person is able to read consent for themselves in their preferred format so that they can really understand it, and whether they can provide consent. And not everyone could provide a signature. And so my recommendation here is to include something in your protocol allowing for recorded verbal consent. So you can record consent as an alternative to providing a signature. How about research data collection? Are the tools you use accessible, for example, online surveys? And research dissemination. Who are you communicating your research to? And ensuring that you're going beyond just the academic community. So are you making that information accessible through workshops and other formats to the community it directly involves?
Page down. Slide 9-Akasakas.
So we're going to be interacting a little bit soon, but I did want to kind of just talk a little bit more about how people access information so that you can better understand some of the guidelines I'm going to share. So people with visual impairments may access information in print, so either in regular print or using magnification software, which enlarges the text, screen reading software, which reads the information aloud, like what I'm using today, and Braille, which is a tactile reading and writing system that can be accessed on paper or using electronic devices. Now, what's important to understand here is that if someone is accessing information non-visually, so with a screen reader or Braille, they will miss out on any of the visual features in your information. So for example, if you use color or if you underline text or italicize text, none of that information will come through by default. And that's important to remember if you're using those visual features to communicate really important information. And so we'll talk about that.
Page down. Slide 10-conceal1:::.
So this leads me to tip 1. Do not communicate important information through visual features alone, such as through color, underlining, or italicizing text. A person may miss out on this information. And so here I show a list of tasks. We have meeting with participants, call family members, review consent forms, but only the first two are highlighted in yellow. A person using a screen reader will not be aware of that. So where does this come up? If you're in a research team meeting with colleagues, you may use color to identify who is responsible for different tasks. So for example, if you tell me, Natalie, all the tasks highlighted in yellow are for you, then I would say, well, that's great. I guess I have no tasks. It could come up in research tools as well, right? So you might emphasize different portions of text in a consent form, and that information, again, will be completely unnoticed to someone using a screen reader. So what is an alternative to using color and other visual features? If we're talking about tasks in a meeting, you can put all the tasks for a particular person in a list under their name, right? That's a really clear way. If you're talking about information in research tools like a consent form that you really want to emphasize, you can use a symbol right before the word. For example, a couple of stars, asterisks, and tell that person that they can search for those symbols to really find out what information is important. And that's more clear than really visual features like color that will be completely unnoticed, not only to screen reader users, but to people, for example, with color blindness.
Page down. Slide 11-Larry A grave.
So now I mentioned that some people will be able to read visually using standard print or magnification. And it's easier for most people to understand where certain problems might exist in the way you present visual information. As a sighted person, you can understand looking at this slide where there might be some problems, right? And preferences for readability will vary, but there are certain things you can do to really increase accessibility of visual text. So if I were to ask you, what are some of the problems you see on this particular slide? Any ideas? What do we think?
I would say the background, and also probably the contrast of lettering, which just does not appear. Like you cannot make the difference between letters and backgrounds.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. A lot of this is really obvious and clear to sighted people, right? There's problems with contrast, the size of the font, the spacing between letters. These are examples of problems. They're exaggerated on this slide, but there are things that you can think about.
Page down.
So let's talk about this a little bit more.
Slide 12-Conceal 2:utilises des polices de character simples et bien.
So if we think about font, you want to use sans serif's font. So what I mean by that is Verdana or Arial are really good fonts to use for readability. You want to avoid very decorative fonts like Times New Roman, or, for example, very decorative fonts like script or cursive, because it's just too much clutter and difficult to read. Okay, and I will send a copy of this PowerPoint so that you have this information. You should use at least a 12-point font and no smaller. Now, standard size large print is actually 18-point font if you're printing something out for someone to give someone physically, but you can use 12-point font in an electronic document, and a user can then modify it to the size that they particularly need. Right? You want to ensure that there's good color contrast. So for example, use black writing on a white background or vice versa, and avoid other color contrasts that might be difficult to see. In terms of the layout, you want to left align your text. So just ensure that there's a good, you don't kind of justify the text or squish all your letters together to make it more maybe visually appealing, but difficult to read, okay? And we talked about not using color or other visual features like underline or italicize to express important information. So these are some ways to really increase accessibility for people with low vision.
Page down. Slide 13-Conceal 3:.
So tip 3, ensure you've set the correct document language. So what am I talking about here? In Microsoft Word, you have the ability to set the language of your document. Now, for most people, this is important specifically for spelling, right? You want to make sure that Microsoft Word knows what language you are writing in so that it knows how to spell check that document, right? But for reading a document with a screen reader, this becomes really important because if your language is incorrectly set, a screen reader will try to read it in the wrong language. This becomes really important in documents that include more than one language, which is very common in Quebec. So for example, in a consent form or an invitation to participate, you might have both English and French text. You want to ensure that that English and French text is correctly identified as English and French so that the screen reader will read it correctly. Otherwise, it will be completely unintelligible to someone using a screen reader. So on the next slide, you will listen to what it sounds like when my screen reader tries to read text in the wrong language. You'll have English text read in English, followed by French text read in French, followed by an English text read using the French screen reading voice to understand what this is like.
Page down.
Heading level 1
Slide
English
414.
text in an English voice. Nothing new here. Buses are subjected to the same difficulties on the road as motorists. Fender benders, blocked streets and slippery roads can disrupt their drive as well. Under these conditions, we make every effort to ensure service as planned, despite the bad weather. Heading level 1 French text in a French voice.
Lors d'une tempête, on opte pour la régularité et la sécurité, c'est-à-dire qu'on répartit les bus pour avoir des passages à intervalles réguliers. C'est tout un défi pour les employés du centre opérationnel qui restent en contact permanent avec les chauffeurs et les chefs d'opération afin d'adapter les trajets aux besoins.
Heading level 1 English text in a French voice.
On se stormy over, c'est le quisier du trafic d'instruction arstée ou tard. Snowbank, parquet 42 trucs, slogan trafic and macro travel, raté difficult. We work closely with the city of Montreal to optimize the removal operation and the power hardware and make it easy to access our bus line.
All right, so now the
Page down.
screen reader might be difficult
Slide
for you
50.
to understand in general because you're not used to it. But hopefully what you can see or hear is that it becomes completely unintelligible in that last portion of the text because that English text was incorrectly marked as French. Okay, so how do you set the correct language? So first of all, you need to select the text for which you want to set the correct language. And on the bottom of the screen, where it shows the word count, you will see what language is currently selected. You want to left click on this text and a dialog box will appear for the language and you could select the correct language you'd like. Okay, so I have a screenshot here again, but I will send this PowerPoint so that you can try it as well.
Page down. Slide 16 dash conceal for colon
Okay.
utilises de utilises.
So let's continue. So use properly marked headings in longer documents to help organize your text is my next tip. So what does this mean? This is the most misunderstood feature of Microsoft Word, yet it is the most powerful way to increase the accessibility of your documents. So when you have a long document, as a general rule, you usually like to include titles, right? To kind of separate the different sections of that document. So you might think of, for example, a consent form where you have sections for nature of participation, eligibility, rights and responsibilities. You might think of research dissemination, right? Your manuscript, where you have sections for introduction, methods, results, discussion. Right? So visually, having these section titles will help a sighted person quickly skim through text. But if you don't mark these titles as proper headings, then a screen reader will not know that they are titles. So what this means is that you don't want to just center your text and underline it to make it a title. There is a way to tell Microsoft Word that this text you've selected, that title, is a real heading. And when you do that, a screen reader user can use keyboard commands on their computer to quickly navigate between different sections. That makes navigation much easier. It's akin to skimming, right? And so when you have properly marked headings, you're really increasing the user-friendly aspect of your document for your participants.
Page down.
So let's
Slide
talk a little
17.
bit more about how you can use headings in longer documents to increase accessibility. Headings are organized in a hierarchy. So with each successive heading kind of referring to a different subsection of text. So on this slide, I show some examples. For example, chapter 1 would be a heading level 1. It's the outermost title of your document, right? Within chapter 1, you might have a section called My Childhood. So this is heading level 2 because it's a section within the chapter. Within My Childhood, you may have a section called, for example, My Younger Years, 0 to 5. Or, for example, you may have another section called Early School Experiences, 6 to 12. These are sections within My Childhood, so they are heading level 3. Okay, so heading level 1 refers to kind of the outermost section of your document. And then within that, you may have an inner section of text, heading level 2, and within that, heading level 3. Now, for most of you, you'll never have such a long text that you need to ever worry about heading level 3, but it's still good for you to know what heading level you're talking about, because you can tell Microsoft Word what kind of a heading it is. And then the screen reader can navigate, for example, between all the heading level 1, so each chapter of your dissertation, for example, or between all the inner headings, if that's what they prefer.
Page down.
So here's a little activity to
Slide
see how
820.
we understand this. So if I were to ask you on this slide, what are some examples of heading level 1, 2, or 3? Any ideas? What do we think?
I would say that there's a country, the provinces, and the cities.
Yes, exactly, right? So this is a really clear example where countries would be heading level 1. A province would be heading level 2 because it's within a country. And a city would be heading level 3 because it's within the province. So just to help you kind of understand that structure. But again, as I said, for most of your documents, like a consent form, each of those sections you could just make heading level 1. And you don't usually have such a long document that you would need to go beyond that. But you do want to mark them as proper headings, again, to facilitate navigation.
Page down.
So how do you do
Slide
that?
99.
So to turn a line of text into a heading, you want to select the text that you'd like to turn into a heading, and it's only a few words, right? Because we're talking about a title. On the ribbon bar at the top of the screen, you will see a home group. Okay, I'm not sure what it's called in French, but in English and Microsoft Word, it's called the home group. And when you select the home group, a style box will appear called Styles, and you could select the heading you'd like for that text, heading level 1, 2, or 3. And it's as simple as that. Once you do that, go to select your text, home group styles, select your heading level type. That text will be turned into a heading, and a screen reader will be able to easily navigate between the titles of your consent form or your manuscript. And having reviewed many articles for journals, I really encourage you to do this, please. All right.
Page down. Slide 20 dash conceal.
Tip 5, use simple tables when tables are needed and for nothing else. Okay, so you can use tables to present truly tabular data. So for example, results in your research project, right? So in a manuscript or in a summary of results that you send to participants, you might include a table. What sometimes happens is that people will use tables to make their text look visually appealing, even if it's not actually needed. So some examples of this. You might see, for example, a table box as a border around some text in an invitation to an event or an invitation to participate in a research study. So there's a border around the text like a table. There's really no need for it to be there. It's visually decorative, but the problem is that it prevents someone from a screen reader from reading that text. Okay, so you really want to avoid using text boxes or tables just for decorative reasons. Okay, similarly, what you might see sometimes in maybe a summary of results that you send to participants or in an invitation to participate is information designed like 2 columns, like a newspaper article. This is also a problem for screen readers because the screen reader will read from the beginning of the line to the end of the line. It will not understand that this is 2 columns of text. And so the text will make no sense to a screen reader user. So you want to avoid, again, using tables to present information in 2 columns of text. You can use tables to present your data, right? And so I show an example of a simple table where you have the same number of rows and columns in the table and you're presenting your data. It's very consistent and clear, and a screen reader user can navigate through the table to see what you've written. The key here, though, is that when you're presenting data in a table, you want to keep it simple.
Page down.
You do not want
Slide 21
what I show
conceal.
here, which is a very complex table with merged cells. So there are not the same number of rows and columns on every line of the table. This is a problem because it becomes very difficult for a screen reader user to navigate through the table and to remember what column or row they are on if the number of rows and columns is not always the same, okay? So you really just want to be consistent. Do not merge columns and rows. Ensure that there are the same number of columns and rows on each line. And if it's a very complex table, you may want to consider putting a visual or verbal description, a caption below your table to explain the big takeaway. All right.
Page down.
A few words
Slide
about
2022.
the accessibility of different formats. So you may save your information, whether we're talking about invitations to participate, consent forms, research results, maybe an interview guide for a focus group that you send participants, in different file formats. It's important to know that not all of these formats are equally accessible to people who use assistive technology, not just people who have visual impairments. Okay, so for example, JPG is a file extension for completely image-based files. This is what you might have for a poster image, for example. Very commonly used when you want to announce a research study, right? It's an image. It's a picture So obviously somebody who is non-visual will not be able to access it. So you want to avoid using those. A PDF will only be accessible if it's properly designed to be accessible, which involves a bit of learning. And so most people don't know how to make PDFs accessible. The problem with PDFs is that they often are photocopied pictures of other documents or handouts or physical handouts or older documents. So the quality of the PDF is not always good, and a screen reader might have trouble reading it. The other problem with PDFs is that they are protected. And so anyone who's using assistive technology will be unable to modify the font or other features to meet their needs. I really recommend by default that you use Word, because Word tends to be a simple way to ensure accessibility if you apply the strategies that we're talking about today.
Page down. Slide 23 conceal 7 :
Okay. So let's talk about image accessibility, because this comes up a lot. Graphics, images, or other kind of visual pictures are completely inaccessible to screen reader users, but also to other people who use assistive technology. For example, sometimes people with certain types of learning disabilities. Alternative text refers to a method you can use to attach a written description to your images. And when you do this, a screen reader software will read that description aloud when it encounters the image in your document. So when does this come up in research? Well, it comes up a lot, right? So you might use an image in Word, for example, in a manuscript, figures and graphs, or if you're sharing a poster of your announcement for your study, it might be in a Word document as an image. It comes up a lot in PowerPoint. When you're sharing the results of your research, you might include images in your PowerPoint of figures and graphs, but also other pictures, like, for example, a picture of your research team. It might come up in social media, right? A lot of people share poster images or memes to share their study announcements. And this will be completely inaccessible unless you include alternative text.
Page down. Slide 24 images.
So how do you add accessible images in Word? The process is actually very simple. You just need to right-click on the image, and you will see an option called Edit Alt Text. And you click on that, and you write your description. And once you've done that, a screen reader user will see that description when they're navigating to that image.
Page down.
Now, there
Slide
are some
25 conceals pour la description des.
There are some things that you want to keep in mind when writing alternative text descriptions for images. You want to keep it short, usually only a sentence or two. If it's a more complicated image, you might want to write it directly in your document rather than as a description of your image. So think about the elevator pitch that all of you I know have been told is important for your research, right? How can you describe the big takeaway in just a few sentences? Think about why you're including that image and only talk about what's really important for people to understand. It may not be important, for example, for people to know the background of an image showing your research team. It may be more important for them to know that your research team consists of 10 people, so many of whom are students versus faculty, and so on. Okay? You also want to think about the text in an image. So for example, if you think about social media when you're advertising your invitations, your images, your memes, your poster images might have some text in it. That is also not accessible to a screen reader user if it's within a picture. Okay, so in your alternative text description, also write out the text that is in your picture because it will not be accessible to a screen reader user.
Page down.
So let's talk
Slide
about this a little
2026.
bit. As I mentioned, alternative text should really be kept simple. So why don't we think about, for example, an image that shows that option A has more votes than option B. So I showed different examples of alternative text for this pie chart. And I'm wondering if anyone has any thoughts for what would be a good alternative text description and what would be the worst alternative text description. So I will read them out loud. I have the English translation here and the French is on the slide. So for example, option 1, a pie chart depicting the results of the vote. Option A, shown in green, 98%. Option B, shown in blue, 2%. Another description might be, for example, option A was by far the most popular. And then finally, another description is a pie chart that shows the results of the vote. So which do we think is the best description here?
I would say the third one.
Which one?
The third one.
The third one? Okay. Any other ideas?
The third one on the screen is the one with the numbers.
The big description, yeah.
Yes.
Perfect. Yes, so that is the best one, right? And the reason is because it specifically tells you.
Option.
Yeah. So it's because it specifically tells you not just which option is most popular, but what the percentage is. 98% versus 2%. So if you only say a chart showing the results of the vote, that's nice, but then the person doesn't know what are the results. And if you only say which option is most popular, but without saying how popular, then the person will have no context. So this is kind of just to help you think about what is the big takeaway of what you're trying to communicate in your description.
Page down.
So
2027.
Here I show the instructions for including alternative text
has joined the
in
meeting.
a Twitter post. And actually at the end of this PowerPoint in the resources, I also show how you do this for Facebook. It's very simple. So once you add an image to Twitter, on the lower right-hand side of the image, you will see a little image called the Add Alt Text button. And you can go there to write your description. And then when a screen reader user encounters your little meme or poster image for your study, they will hear the written description that you've appended to that image. I encourage you to all try it out. And if you want me to confirm whether it's worked, you can always tag me. My Twitter information is on the title slide. What's important to know is that an alt text description will not visually show. It's only something that a screen reader user will see. So you may not know whether alt text is there, but you should do it for all your images, regardless of whether we're talking about research communication tools or not, because it just helps us practice what we preach.
Page down. Slide 28-Créer des.
Now, it's beyond the scope of this talk to really get into the details of PowerPoint, but I do include some tips on this slide. And what I just wanted to highlight here is that you can also add alt text description to your PowerPoint slides when you're presenting results at conferences by just right-clicking on the image, and you will see Add Alt Text, and you can add your alt text description.
Page down. Slide 29-Conference seals.
So we haven't talked too much about data collection tools in terms of online surveys, right? So obviously, if for example, this is a focus group interview guide and you're sending it to all your participants in advance, you can use all the strategies I shared about how to make information accessible in Microsoft Word. But what about an online survey? I just want to highlight that there are online web accessibility guidelines, and I include the link here where you could learn more. When you're choosing an online survey platform, look on the homepage and see if there's an accessibility link or any mention as to whether they follow these standards. If they do, that's great. If they don't, that's not a good sign and you probably shouldn't use it. Now, even if they do say they follow the standards, there may still be accessibility problems. So it's really important to always test your survey before launching it with somebody who's an expert in assistive technology, who often may be a user. And here I have to stress the importance of compensating people with disabilities when you ask them to review your documents for accessibility. It's also good to test this in advance, not just for accessibility, but to see how long it takes someone with assistive technology to complete your survey, because it may take longer than it does for someone who does not use assistive technology. Very broadly speaking, the simpler the better. So if you have questions where people could type in their answers, that works well. If you have multiple choice questions where they could choose one or more answers, that often works well. Problems come up when you have visual questions. For example, choose your geographic location on this map, right? It's an image, so that will not be accessible. Or visual questions that involve a lot of visual interaction. For example, drag and drop or match these answers with other answers, right? So these are examples of kind of visually complex questions that you want to avoid. But you can learn more using the resources in this document.
Page down.
So to conclude for
Slide
today,
30
because I am looking at the time, I really hope that this is the beginning of a conversation. And I want to share just a few concluding thoughts on how you could become a more supportive ally to colleagues and participants with and without disabilities in research to better ensure accessibility and inclusion. So first, listen to and elevate the firsthand voices of people with lived experience. So show others that accessibility matters to you. So amplify this message of accessibility and inclusion, even if it doesn't personally affect you. You can get involved by joining us in these efforts. So I include information about the international network of researchers with visual impairments and their allies. So allies is an important word here, right? Because we need to be working collectively on this to really advance accessibility and inclusion. Take positive action. Attach meaningful actions to your words. So there are a lot of small things you could do to increase accessibility and inclusion. You can start applying the guidelines I've included in this document in your own research communication tools and reach out if you have any questions. You can also learn more about how else you can increase accessibility. For example, consider producing your business cards in print and braille, and I include a link for where you could get these produced. It's a great awareness moment, so it's accessible, but it also raises awareness among your other colleagues about the importance of accessibility whenever you give one of your business cards. And then finally, continue learning. There's a lot you can do to continue this learning, and it's okay not to have all the answers. So you can follow the hashtag accessibility on Twitter, which is hashtag A11Y, to see what conversations are happening related to accessibility in research and practice. You can read the firsthand perspective of people with lived experience. I include the title of a great book called Haben, the first deafblind woman to conquer Harvard Law School, where she shares a lot of experiences related to accessibility. I also include a link to CIHR, where you could learn more about accessibility and systemic ableism in health research, as well as resources to increase the accessibility and inclusion of your own research communications.
Page down.
So,
Slide
in
30.
conclusion, I really hope that this launches a conversation that we can continue. You've all likely heard about the medical and social models of disability. And where we often traditionally think about disability through medical terms as a problem within the individual, the social model really highlights how we can modify the environment to minimize or even eliminate the disabling barriers that your colleagues and participants experience. So this is really empowering because this means that we can increase the accessibility and inclusion of our information through our own perceptions and practices. This places the responsibility on us collectively
Samantha Wynn
as
has
a
joined the
community.
meeting.
And this is really empowering because these are changes we can make. We can't change impairments, but we can change disability. And so, for example, if I'm at a research conference and I'm provided with an electronic accessible version of the conference program, I'm not disabled in that moment, even though I am blind. So I'll leave you with those thoughts, and I'm happy to answer any questions. Thank you again for inviting me.
Thank you so much, Natalina. It was an amazing talk and really interesting subject. So we are really short on time, but maybe we can allow one or two questions. So I'll leave it to. I don't know, Philippe, si tu es pressé ou je veux vraiment pas. C'est moi qui ai pris du retard un peu au début, donc
Pas de problème pour moi.
Donc dans ce cas-là, si vous avez des questions, n'hésitez pas à les poser. Don't hesitate to ask a question to Natalina.
Perfect.
Tassin, I see you raise your hand.
Yes, thank you so much, Natalie. It was a great section and really informative. So I just have two quick questions. When it comes to sending emails, does the same rule apply?
That's a great question. So when you're writing an email, like in the body of your email, usually these are very straightforward. They're just kind of simple messages. So there really aren't all these accessibility problems. The problems kind of come up when you include the things that I've mentioned in this document. Like if you have an image in your email, a person using assistive technology will not know about that image unless you include a description. But most simple emails won't include those problems. So you want to just be thinking about those same aspects I touched on, like if it's an info letter, for example, a newsletter in the body of the email and it's very long, ensure that you have headings, properly marked headings for each of those sections.
Okay, thank you. And a second one. So what has been your general observation with journal articles and publications? You know, it's a different thing to submit to the organization in an accessible format, and it's a different thing for them to have it published in the same format. So are there any variations you've observed in general regarding that?
Yes. And this is where advocacy is really needed, because most peer-reviewed journals are not accessible on the front end, so the actual published articles are not accessible. But they're also not accessible on the back end, which means someone with a disability is often unable to submit their work on their own, which really is a problem, again, for gatekeeping of knowledge and who is communicating information in our field. Most peer-reviewed journals do not have guidelines that require, for example, authors to include alternative text descriptions of their images or headings and things like that. And so what I would say here is to raise it, right? There are positive ways to raise awareness of this. You can just say, listen, I work in the field of rehabilitation and disability. This is really important to me, even though I don't have a disability. And I'd really like to know if the journal has any guidelines related to accessibility, and if not, whether they would be open to having this conversation. And you could reach out to people with lived experience to be kind of part of that conversation.